Then coming next to that, that little orange in there is a flying dragon citrus. That is actually a hardy orange into zone 6. And then yes, it is prolific. Our trees here in Maryland are covered in these little sour oranges, but they're beautiful. And it's just such an amazing edible landscape look to have oranges in your yard. And they're gorgeous. Anyway, so without further ado, this is one of my first books that this talk is fashioned after. It's a very how-to book. We're going to cover a little bit of each chapter that's in it tonight. This is my second book, just came out, For the Love of Pawpaws. I shall have to restrain myself tonight from talking about pawpaws, just a little bit. Fortunately, Charlie gave another webinar on that. I live in this circular straw bale house in Maryland. We live in Frederick, Maryland. We're in the foothills of the Blue Ridge Mountains. We live on about 25 acres of land, mostly wooded with a beautiful creek that runs through it. So our place is called Long Creek Homestead. And we have food forests, we grow mushrooms, we do natural building, we have extensive gardens, a lot of workshops here. We really focus on how-to. And we're becoming pretty well known for our annual Pawpaw Festival, which happens the third Saturday in September. Here's the front door. One of my friends calls this the Hobbit Mansion. But it's a beautifully made, handmade, crafted home that took us about 4 to 5 years to build. So if you come down to the Pawpaw Fest or some of our other events, we usually have an open house, and you can come in and see all the magic inside. So since I have a lot to cover tonight, I'm really going to just jump in with one of the quintessential permaculture edible landscape designs, the herb spiral. Now I say herb, but you can also plant these, with your hosta collection, your ferns. It does not have to be herbs. It does not have to be in full sun. These are garden spirals. One of the things I really like about these is that aside from being a growing bed, it creates habitat. So typically, a lot of our landscapes lack habitat for beneficial insects, salamanders, frogs, things that help balance the overall insect ecology in our landscape. So having a lot of stone, having piles of sticks, not having it so cleaned up is a good thing. But we do many of us live in suburbia, and things have to look nice. So this is a great combination of creating edible architecture, you're creating habitat, and you're getting to grow a cornucopia of plants. In this case, a lot of herbs. Now, this is the south face of that same spiral. And this one's about 6 feet in diameter by about 3 feet high. And this is what I call a dry stack method. And I'll share a little bit about that in a minute, because there's 2 styles of herb spirals that I like to work with. But this is a little excerpt from my book that shows how you can work with the different cardinal directions of the herb spiral. So the very top, where it's sunny and dry, great place for your very sun-loving, drought-tolerant herbs and plants like rosemary and thyme, oregano, sages. As you come down and you're facing east, you get a little bit of that afternoon sun protection, great place for things like parsley. South again, celebrate the sages, put your tomato plant in there. Comes around to the north and it's lower, put in some of that land cress, make a little small pond for frogs, again, good habitat, or some of your watercress. You can play with this concept, in so many creative, fun ways. And I encourage you to actually Google image herb spirals, and you will see a lot of fascinating ideas, from very simple to really ornate and beautiful. So this is how I lay out. These are granite blocks. These are granite stone blocks, which are relatively common. If you go to landscape yards and stone yards, granite blocks are there. And the first chapter of my book outlines how to build this, the material lists that you'll need. Tonight I'm just going to touch on this because we're going to cover a lot of different subjects. But if you want to unpack it, it is in the book. And very simple. If you accomplished kindergarten or the equivalent, you can build one of these. It's really very straightforward. The courses in masonry terms, of course, is every next level. They just begin every 2.5 blocks, and it guides you in how to raise the spiral. And here you see it going in the very center. I use a little bit of whatever scrap I have because you won't see it. And when you build your spiral, this will make more sense because that all gets covered with soil all the way up to the top. And if it's a really tall one like this, I will put a little bit of gravel in the base. And that just helps for any excess water, especially in the wintertime, to drain out versus, freezing and thawing can kind of make your herb spiral a little wonky. Now, this is what I call a dry stack, a freestanding herb spiral, because you're actually building it with stone in place, then you're putting the soil in it. And this is beneficial when you really need your spiral to look a certain way and stay in a certain spot. Like I'll build these for restaurants. I'll put these outside of people's front yards and, in very urban and suburban areas. And, they want it to stay looking a certain way. So it has that benefit. The backside of this style is that there's not a whole lot of soil in there, right? There's only about 8 inches, running up the bed there. And that can dry out very quickly, especially when you have all that stone, right? You're also kind of creating a microclimate. You're going to warm it up. So you guys in the cooler climates, this actually will notch you up. And certain things that may not overwinter for you might overwinter in an herb spiral. Some of those rosemaries, potentially a pomegranate, really tough, hardy Russian pomegranate could maybe overwinter in one of these. And
Michael,
so, yeah.
Folks are asking if you can hit presentation view.
Oh, shucks. Yeah. Right, you are.
Very good.
Oh, that's much better, right? Okay.
Yes, thank you.
All right. All right.
Thank you, Tim, for saying so.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you.
I still don't have the screen sharing.
Oh, you don't?
No.
Okay, Stephanie, we'll take that offline. I'll just
Great. Thank you.
I'll go into the chat box.
Thank you.
All right. So here's your dry stack spiral all done. Another small secret that I'll share is you see the cardboard that I have down here, and I have the cardboard extending past the edge, another 6 to 8 inches. That's so that the grass won't leap right back into your spiral. And then you can go ahead and mulch that. And that gives you a little bit of time before that grass would want to start, getting back into your spiral. So I was saying this can dry out rather quickly. So it's wonderful for very, very drought tolerant Mediterranean type herbs. You could get creative and stick a little irrigation system up through the middle as you're building it. But if you want to design for neglect, which is what I typically do and recommend, just plant your very drought tolerant plants in a dry stack. Here's a little, they create wonderful focal points on the landscape. Even in the wintertime, they're this edible architecture that stays there and, reminds us that the season will come again rather than just kind of everything being down and lost. It really holds, space and hope during the winter. This is one I built for a client who was a very busy lady, and she said she wanted to be able to pick her herbs as she walked in to the door from work. So we played with it, and we did a little bit of a Fibonacci spiral here. So again, play with it, make it fit with your aesthetics, the stone you like, and the space. I do recommend putting them where you flow, walking towards your house, somewhere you can see it outside your kitchen garden, your kitchen window, so that it it really draws you to come out and use it and interact with it. And again, if you live in a very shady spot, you could do something more ornamental or do fiddlehead ferns, some of your more shade tolerant plants. They're just beautiful. And again, they create habitat. So those stones are beneficial habitat. And that's really one of the best things about the spirals, beyond all the wonderful food and the microclimates they create. Things really do well in these because they're basically a very large raised bed with a fast draining soil. So the right plants would really love it. Okay, this is a ginormous, this is 12 feet in diameter. So there's really no limits on the herb spiral. It's a matter of stone and earth. This one I call free, this is a free form in the sense that it's really just a pile of compost and soil that's ideally dumped where you need it. Otherwise you will burrow it in. And you shape the pile of earth and compost. This is probably about 60% topsoil, 40% compost as a mix. And then you shape the spiral the way you want it. And I know I mentioned the cardinal directions, but a lot of times I will position a spiral so that it aesthetically fits the space. So again, be flexible. So the benefit of this is that you have a lot more soil. You have a lot more moisture holding capacity. The plants have a lot more access to a lot more nutrients and moisture, and you can grow a lot more than just drought tolerant plants in a spiral like this. They don't have to be this big. This was a centerpiece I was commissioned to build for a park, center of a butterfly garden. So we dumped this. This is probably about 6 yards of mix and 1 pallet of stone. Then you just place the stone along the spiral. It doesn't have to go all the way down. The stones don't have to be that symmetrical. They don't have to stack that well naturally, which allows you more freedom in the type of stone you use. So if you have a lot of round stones and things like that, this is a great technique. And you just slightly lean the stones in. Now, over time, this will move a little bit, but I've noticed that really only adds charm to the spirals. I've not really, noticed them to lose their appeal. Now, make sure you're going at least 3 feet high. If you do these, especially these freeform ones, at a lower, maybe 2 feet, over time, you kind of lose the look of the spiral, and it kind of looks like a little bit of a spiral garden, flat garden. So height makes a difference in these. I typically go for 3 feet. This is another free form. This is in the back yard, an urban environment. You can see on either side here, it's a very skinny yard. This was a client who said, I want a garden, but I've only got this one spot that gets sun. And I was like, okay, well, to maximize that, let's do a spiral, because you get a lot more space for the footprint, right? Because you're spiraling up, you're going to get a lot more for that real estate. And this is 4 yards mixed soil and compost, and then that's like even though it's somewhat dry stacked, really that's just coming around the formed pile that we made. And she's made this her whole garden. She's got tomatoes, cucumbers, all her herbs in there, flowers. We did stick a stepping stone in there. They're just in the bed about 3 feet for her to be able to reach the center. But this has become a very productive garden. And since it has all that stone, it starts early in the season and it goes late into the season. So you are creating a microclimate with all of the stone in place. So I can't say enough about herb spirals and garden spirals. They're beautiful. They're super productive. The one thing I would keep an eye on is making sure that, that they don't dry out too easily on you. Okay. Oh, and this was a picture somebody had sent me a couple months after my book had come out and said, loved your book, look what I built. And I like it because it's not even edible. It's like they have, all kinds of little flowers in there, and that's okay. It's really whatever purpose you feel called to use it for. And again, habitat, beauty, they're just a win-win almost regardless of what you plant. Okay. So these are two pawpaws sitting on a swale, and they've got a lead plant. This is a nitrogen fixing plant from the prairies. So right after I took this picture, I actually chopped and dropped that as a mulch and a fertilizer for those pawpaws. But I'm not going to get lost on talking about pawpaws. What I want to talk about is that swale, right? So a swale is a basin, a dugout basin, and that soil gets put on the downhill side. It becomes a berm. So the swale is a basin and a berm. Now the whole swale in this case is on contour, which means that it's perfectly perpendicular to the slope. So that as water comes down, it falls into that basin. And since that basin is perfectly on contour, the water stops and it sinks in. And it hydrates the water table for 20, 30, 40 feet down slope. And it makes the landscape verdant. Not just for that raised bed, but for all that's below it, whether that's lawn, whether that's your rose garden, your vegetable garden. This design has one of the most powerful effects on landscapes that I work with. I would say 90% of my landscape work usually involves some form of swale because of how effective it is. So basically, you're putting in place passive irrigation, right? So every time it rains, you are harvesting that water. You're not losing it. It's not washing off site. It's staying and it's holding and it's building soil and it's in the right zone for all the plants to take up. Now, there's a few caveats around, where you may not want to do a swale. And we're going to cover that. And we're going to go into detail about swales and swale building in another webinar. So I'm really just going to touch on the concept here. But they're beautiful. They're sinuous. They follow the contour of the landscape. So they just naturally fit. So when you're doing swales across your landscape, people may not recognize exactly what you're doing, but they're going to be in awe at just how well it just matches with the place, because it's following the natural curves. This is actually a edible woodland garden I helped create for Top Chef Brian Voltaggio at his Volt restaurant. This back area was just, a couple of these large trees and it was all washed out. The parking lot was right out of view here. It was washing all that zone out with water. So I built a small rain garden. That's a rain garden there, that tier-shaped rain garden. And rain gardens are on a small residential scale are really just depressions with a fast draining soil. Not complicated. It's just an opportunity for that water to stop and sink in. When this overflows, the swales behind it catch it. So this now is right outside their kitchen door, so they can come out and they can pick, all the wild flavors of the woods that we've planted there. And we have mushroom logs, and it's just dramatically changed the space. This is designed for a kitchen garden where a lot of water was coming off the roof and the patio. And this area was actually pretty wet, a little bit boggy. So by digging out the basins and building up the berms, we got above that wet zone. The roots were able to, have freedom and then access that moisture. And the food that's grown out of this garden, it just explodes. It's so much. It's just like the perfect setup. Even during drought, these swaled gardens stay verdant without watering as long as you're mulching well. Again, swales have wonderful ecological benefits beyond, or I should say beside being edible. So this client wanted to steward the runoff from her roof and her driveway. And so we built a couple small swales, and she loved tulips. So let's plant tulips. Again, this is ecological and edible, and ecological being the foundation. and then edible being, sort of the cherry on top. But it doesn't have to be. You can make these fit your aesthetics, your interest, your sight, and really they're benefiting the broader landscape that you live in. All right, that's my amazing wife digging a big swale. This was for a client who really wanted to capture all the water on her landscape, and that's my little boy running down the swale. Soon he'll be digging them, I hope. But you can see the basin and you can see the berm. Again, this is a big one. In my book, I give dimensions for an average sort of, suburban yard. And then here you can see the swales are on contour are a little bit at different places and different angles because there's different slopes. And now this has been planted up into a food forest. So this is now sort of a diversified orchard where the plants and the trees and the ground covers are all covering all of these berms. It's an instant change to the landscape. All right. This is a view of our garden, our fenced in, our deer garden here, and a couple of things. So I often, when I'm doing gardens, I'll do one swale right after the other. So I'll go basin, berm, basin, berm, basin, berm. Typically the first basin and berm's harvesting most of the water that's coming into the zone. But by creating the basins and the berms, I'm creating microclimates. And in these basins, I fill those up with wood chips, and those become the walking path between the berms and the beds. And they're holding consistent moisture. So even during droughts and even normal times of the year, it's slowly emanating humidity, which the plants love. And it's composting down in place so that every couple of seasons, I'll come through my pathways and I will dig them out, and it's just this black compost, fungi rich compost right there, and I throw it on the beds, and that's how I feed my beds. And then I throw down more wood chips, and then I'm generous with my straw. I keep my beds covered, I keep my soil covered, and since I'm harvesting all the water, I don't have to ever use a hose. I don't ever have to use drip irrigation. I don't have to do any kind of irrigation, even during drought. And it's been fortunate. There's been quite a few years since we've had a real drought. I think it was 4 years ago we had a strong drought, and everybody's landscape was down and brown, and they were all pulling out hoses trying to just keep it to surviving. And these swaled gardens, not only were they verdant, but they were productive. So they weren't just surviving, they were actually pumping. And I wasn't doing anything. So really kind of setting the stage, what we call in permaculture, these are earthworks. Shape your earth, get that water harvesting passively, and it really starts to function really well for itself. And then you can hang out in the hammock, right? All right, mushrooms. So here in the mid-Atlantic and the Northeast, we've got wonderful rainfall and humidity, and this is mushroom country. In permaculture, we look at what's doing well in our environment naturally without any input. And we interact with that element, whether it's pawpaws, whether it's mushrooms, what's doing really well, so that when you interact with it, it is a success without a whole lot of work. And mushrooms fall into this category. We see mushrooms growing well around us. So it's like, okay, well, look, they're doing well. Why don't we touch that and put in the type of mushrooms that we would like? Shiitakes, oysters, wine caps, potentially lion's manes, It's just a cornucopia waiting to be, celebrated. And a lot of folks come to me and say, well, my yard's so shady, I can't grow anything. And I get this big cheese on my face and I'm like, nah, it's perfect. It's perfect for mushrooms. And they're a fruit. They're a food. So it's a great way to take advantage of those shady areas to really grow food. And mushrooms, when you do them right, especially shiitake and oyster and wine caps, are very productive. You will get a lot of mushrooms, and you will get a lot of tasty mushrooms. One of the main reasons to grow these mushrooms is that when you're growing them outside in the landscape, usually on woody substrates, and they're in the elements, year round, you don't bring them inside. They have all of that elemental energy and flavor in them. So it's like wild mushrooms, but these are select varieties from centuries of gathering and selecting, so that you're getting the best tasting mushrooms grown outside. There's really hardly anything like it. When you're going to the grocery store and you're buying shiitakes, typically they're grown on sawdust blocks in a warehouse, and they kind of taste like it, especially when you compare them to something you grow outdoors. So, I shouldn't knock those guys, because when I run out of my logs, I buy them, and I'm happy to have them. But these are absolutely delicious. I had some today. Oh, and this is my disclaimer that when you do grow mushrooms, you might get a little nutty. I mean, it's really exciting because you don't necessarily, especially when you first start, you can't believe how prolific these are. And usually, and I'll explain here the process for making them, but it can take up to a year before the log starts to fruit. So you've kind of forgotten, you're thinking, oh, maybe this isn't going to work. And then all of a sudden, bam, the whole log explodes, and you just got all these mushrooms. And this is what happens. So it's a warning. They're a lot of fun. Okay. So the key ingredient to successful mushroom growing is good dark beer. Write that down. Actually, you should wait till you're done drilling to drink your beer. So what we're doing here is we're drilling logs. These are hardwood logs typically that we harvest at winter's end when they're dormant. So for example, for shiitakes, oaks are wonderful. Hard maples are really good for shiitake as well. So we're looking for small 6-inch diameter wood from healthy trees. And a lot of times these come down during the winter and storms, and that's great wood to gather and to use. And then you're drilling and you're drilling the whole way around the log, and then you're inserting your spawn. Now, spawn is a term for usually a woody substrate. In this case, it's a little wooden dowel that has the mycelium on it, the type of mushroom, right? So the shiitake strain is on that dowel. You hammer it into the log, it jumps off and starts to eat the wood, because this category of mushroom that most of our culinary mushrooms come from are called saprophytic. And really, they're also nicknamed the wood munchers, because that's their medium that they eat. They eat decaying or dead wood. So they're going to run through that log, and when they're happy, they're going to start fruiting. So that's really kind of the quick gist of growing the mushrooms. I'm going to unpack that a lot more when we do our webinar specifically on that. And then we wax those holes, because mycelium is food. It's food for bees. It's food for all kinds of insects and birds. So we're going to seal each one of those holes, and that also helps seal in the moisture. And then we're going to place these logs where it stays, pretty moist and shady. And then leave them outside. In about a year, they'll start to flush. And depending on the size of the log and the type of wood, they'll fruit anywhere from 3 to 8 years with you doing nothing more. And they'll typically fruit twice a year. You can trick, especially the shiitake, into fruiting 4 times a year. So they can be very prolific without a whole lot of work, which I like. And you can see the shiitakes on these logs just popping out. I mean, that's an average harvest of shiitakes. And these shiitakes are really spongy. They're really tasty. They have a whole different texture and flavor that just changes any dish they go in. Okay, Another favorite mushroom, the mysteriously called wine cap, also called the garden giant. It's Stropharia. And this is a wonderful fungi and mushroom that grows in wood chips and straw. It's what we call a terrestrial fungi. So it runs through organic matter and actually can, once it's established, so in my gardens, which I showed you, which have a lot of organic matter and a lot of moisture, this mushroom will actually fruit in full sun if it has adequate moisture. And that's phenomenal. And they fruit like crazy. Now, ideally what you do to start a wine cap patch is you make kind of a sheet mulch of wood chips and straw, and you're adding in the spawn. In this case, it comes as a sawdust spawn, and you're putting that into the wood chips. And the wood chips, just hardwood chips, you know, they can be even sometimes 3 months old, and that's fine. You need to make sure they're moist. You put in the sawdust spawn and you cover it. And this is ideally done under a deciduous tree. So if you have an existing apple tree, a dogwood, anything like that, this creates a wonderful mulch for the tree. And then that dappled light is perfect for these guys to fruit. And once they're happy, and it doesn't take long, if you start a patch in the early season in March, you'll probably start to get a few mushrooms in the fall, but then next year, next spring and summer, and in that year, they're just going to proliferate. You will potentially see hundreds of mushrooms coming out. And then what I like to do is take a scoop of those wood chips, and that's kind of like you just made spawn, and I take those out to the garden in the middle of the summer, and I sprinkle those around my zucchinis and tomatoes and all my garden plants. And what happens is the fungi jumps off into the soil and the organic matter around my plants, and it begins feeding them additional food in exchange for sugars. And the tomatoes and the zucchinis get more disease resistant, more productive. And then when you're going out and harvesting them, you're also getting your mushrooms. So it's a real win-win, symbiotic, you know, relationship between, I mean, that's why they call it the garden giant, you know, because it does so well in the garden as well. And then if you keep consistent organic matter in your landscape, these guys will stick around. They'll just keep, I now find them all over our landscape because they sporulate. And then as long as there's enough organic matter, they just keep going. Now, they will exhaust their medium pretty quickly if you don't keep them fed. So if you're keeping them just under a tree, about every 18 months, make sure that you're refeeding them wood chips, or they can exhaust that medium, which it just turns it into awesome compost, but you'll lose the fruitingness of it. Okay. Oh, look at those cuties. They literally do just pop up everywhere, and they get huge. They can get huge. I mean, there's some that get to be like 5 pounds. They're better when they're nice and small and the caps are unfurled before they open. Most mushrooms are better before they unfurl. And these have a nice, nutty, meaty kind of flavor and texture to them. They're great grilled. It's just an awesome mushroom. You might see these growing naturally, you know, without you doing anything. They're not super uncommon, partly because they're so strong. They're very opportunistic fungi. So they're used a lot in what's called mycoremediation, sort of helping clean up runoff. They're just awesome. Again, I'll talk a lot more about them and mycoremediation in our webinar that focuses on fungi. Okay, this is a picture of a food forest. So a food forest is not growing food in the forest. It's growing food like the forest. So when we observe a natural, healthy forest ecosystem, we see a lot going on. We see overstory trees, mid-story trees, understory trees. We see a shrub layer. We see ground cover. We see vines climbing up all through it. It's super dense, and it's functioning and supporting itself amazingly, right? So we take that observation, we're like, okay, well, we want to grow things that we're going to eat, our own medicines, you know, our own fibers. maybe fodder for animals. So we take that observation and we come out to our landscape, ideally in full sun or good sun to start a food forest. We're going to take that idea and say, okay, well, instead of planting a tree all by itself with a little bit of mulch around it, let's plant a little ecosystem with it. You know, let's create the support that it needs, right? And that's kind of, you know, the simplification of it. So when we're doing in the temperate climate, when we're creating a food forest, we're not necessarily going to do that stacked overstory, midstory, understory, because the shading will probably prohibit a lot of things from fruiting. So we'll probably usually start at that mid-story or that sort of smaller fruit tree story. And then from there under, we'll start to plant things that companion. This is a little diagram out of my book. Exactly what you pick is not super crucial. I do like to put in things that fix nitrogen through their roots, things in the pea family. Like I showed you earlier, the lead plant, right? I like that, fixes nitrogen. You could do something like false blue indigo, lupins, but getting that nitrogen in there. And I plant those really right in the same hole or within 1 foot of my fruit tree, really close, because it's a nurse plant. It's feeding the root systems of your tree. And if it starts to get too big, then you just chop and drop it, and it's a mulch as well. So it's mulch and fertilizer in place. And this takes you off the hook for bringing in fertility and having to maintain things for your fruit tree. If you set the stage for it up front, it'll largely take care of itself. It's a little ecosystem. So then I like mulch plants. The famous one is comfrey, because it also dynamically accumulates a lot of potassium and other elements from the soil into its leaves. And when it dies or you chop and drop it, it's feeding the topsoil. Insectary plants, things that are going to draw in beneficial insects, things like yarrow, coreopsis. Again, your pollinator plants, again, bringing in more insect balance, increase your fruit set, echinacea. Really, it's the plants that you love, that you fall in love with, that you can put in there, that you will harvest from. Don't be so concerned about exactly what plants it needs to be. It will guide and show you. And really, ultimately, what you're doing is creating diversity. You're creating habitat. You're creating a living mulch by keeping that ground covered. And as long as you're fixing nitrogen and getting a lot of mulch and cycle, then you don't really need to be concerned about the concept of competition here. All right, this is a young food forest patch in, do I have a cursor? Oh, I do. Can you all see that cursor?
Mm-hmm.
All right, so here is a young jujube tree, kind of hard to see in here. And so this is a patch. Now I call it a food forest patch to kind of simplify the idea. So a food forest can also just be 10 feet by 10 feet. It doesn't need to be a big space. It can be any shape you want. It's more of an idea and a concept than, you know, a science. So I have my young jujube tree in here, and we have a lot of deer. So I designed this companion plants. In permaculture, we call these guilds, right? I designed this guild for things that I want to harvest and that will help keep the deer from eating my juicy jujube tree. So here in the top right corner of the patch, I've got Egyptian walking onion, one of my favorite perennial plants. It's trippy. It looks like it's from outer space. And it gets a heavy bulb head and it falls over and it roots and it walks. So it's called Egyptian walking onion. I highly recommend it. There's many times of the year, almost any time of year, you can almost harvest something from it. So the deer don't eat it, right? They don't like that allium crowd at all. There's a little baby pawpaw back there. And anyway, so here is a spiky gooseberry bush, right? So the deer come up to this, they're like, not interested in the onions. They come over here, they poke their nose, they're like, oh, this sucks. They come over here, and this is sage, right? They don't like aromatic herbs, right? They're like, nothing for me here. And they come over here next to that, and that's wormwood, a wonderful medicine, especially if you travel in Latin America a lot. And so the deer are like, don't want that. And they move on by, and they never saw your juicy jujube tree in the middle. So this is just the idea that you can play with these, make them fit the things that you will want to harvest, your aesthetics, or deer protection, or all of the above. There's many variations. And really, it's kind of a go for it situation. If you try to start learning too much about food forests, you might get overwhelmed and you might be like, oh, this is all complicated. I can't do it. Just start doing it. Just start planting things. It'll guide you. Just start is my recommendation when it comes to doing a food forest. Don't feel like it's overwhelming or complicated. It is naturally, but you don't have to worry about all that. Just get things going and you'll see how they cycle. And one of the things that I love about our food forests, aside from the delicious foods, is just being part of that ecosystem, being part of it. So like now when I'm working in the food forest, I'm part of it all. And I get to feel these cycles and how things are interacting and reacting. It's an endlessly fascinating, teacher. All right. Mike's Deluxe Sheet Mulch. This is how I start a food forest patch from scratch. When you go out and look at your yard after this webinar and you're like, that sounded great, but how do I start, right? You're looking at a sea of grass or weeds in full sun. Most soil is pretty crap these days, so we need to create it. So what I do here is I usually will start by throwing down, and this I do ideally a year in advance. So you can use fresh manure. If you've got fresh manure, compost, scraps, whatever, I usually throw, I don't remove the sod or the grass. You want that. That's actually going to die and turn into more nutrient and organic matter in your soil building here. So I'll throw a couple inches of compost, manure, scraps on top of basically on top of the lawn. I'll throw on newspaper and cardboard to make sure that grass is killed off. The worms love it. They come up for it. They tunnel and start to break down the material. Then the deluxe part is where I come in and I'll put in like 4 to 6 inches of wood chips. And then I will generously cover that with straw. And what you're doing is you're putting into place 2 to 3 years of soil building in one go. That bottom layer of compost and scraps and manure is going to break down in one season. And then that second season, those wood chips are going to start coming down and keep feeding the soil biota and the fungi and all the awesome characters that have showed up because there's food and moisture there. And then that'll keep breaking down. Then you come and you plant into that. You basically got compost in place that's also holding moisture. And when you plant into that, things, they grow fantastically because of the moisture and because of the rich fungal environment. Really, so much is about the fungi, and we'll get more into that in the webinar when we really get into food forests and uncommon fruits. We'll get into that a lot more. Here's a sample idea. These are 2 food forest patches about 20 feet apart, typical spacing for your small to mid-sized fruit tree. So it's like, okay, let me do 2 patches at a distance where my mature trees will go. Let me get them started, come back, plant my fruit tree in the middle, get my companion plants going around them. Let me simplify this concept of the food forest to something I can just begin with. And then over time, if you have space, you can add more patches, you can start to sheet mulch between them. And then over time, it just starts to become this magical diversified food forest. But you can simply start with the concept of a patch, right? And not get overwhelmed and say, okay, I want to plant a couple fruit trees. Let me go ahead and just start this. This is also just a great method for starting a pumpkin patch. You can grow anything in this. Once it gets, broken down, it's a wonderful place for whatever you want to plant. So even if you're not sure about, what you're going to plant, but you're thinking, well, look back there along the edge of that fence. It gets good sun, but I'm still way too busy to do anything with it. But I'll tell you what, go throw down some sheet mulch, throw down some cardboard and some wood chips and forget about it. You'll be happy in a couple of years when you do have the time and you come back and you're ready to plant something, it's all juicy and ready for you. So really setting the stage, letting time, moisture, and fungi, do the work for you. It's hard to beat. All right, so food forests really can be any shape. This is right next to a pool. And we've got figs, we've got rose hips, you know, we've got all kinds of alpine strawberries in there. It's a hardy kiwi arbor in the background. So again, be flexible. They can be very ornamental as well. This is Charlie Headington's place down in North Carolina. He's a professor that has like a 30-year-old food forest in his front yard, along the side of his house, his whole backyard. And it's gorgeous. I mean, it is beautiful. It's the most beautiful landscape, interesting landscape in his neighborhood. And it's like a transition when you're coming off the street and you're walking through it into the house. You feel like you've gone through a portal. It's just transforming and very productive. And just, I don't know, I find it so much more, you know, exciting and interesting than most landscapes. So it's so much more than just growing food. All right, there they are. Couldn't resist pawpaws. I'll be quick though, because I am going to talk a lot more about pawpaws in our Uncommon Fruits and Food Forest webinar. But the pawpaw is very unique in the sense that it's basically a tropical fruit that grows in the north, all the way up into zone 5. And further these days because it's so adaptive. So it's the only member of the custard apple family that has migrated all the way north into the temperate zones over millenniums, thousands of years, millions of years, to exist here in the north. And when you get the good genetics of a pawpaw, it is one of the best tasting fruits I've ever had in all my travels in all the world. And it has this custard, banana, mango, pineapple flavors to it that is like nature's dessert. Now, sometimes in the wild, a pawpaw can be small and seedy and bitter, but when you're growing them in your landscape and you're getting the good genetics, it is one of the most exquisite fruits. It is one of the most beautiful edible landscape, what I call all-star plants, because it's low maintenance, it's beautiful, and it's fruitful. Here's a pawpaw in full sun, which is what they prefer for full fruiting. Now, we're used to hearing about pawpaws in the woods, which they do. They'll grow great in full shade, partial shade, and given enough moisture and enough wind protection in the right spots, they love full sun, right? And that's where you get most production too. I mean, you can get 35 to 50 pounds of fruit. So it's not like one or two interesting fruits. It's like, bam, tons of fruit that is delicious. It's like custard ice cream. And then it's beautiful, beautiful fall foliage turning gold, large lobed leaves all season, a pretty architecture in the winter. It is just, I can't say enough about it, and I'd better not say much more. Run out of time. Oh, you can come to our Pawpaw Fest and see all the pawpaws you want, taste all the pawpaws you want, pawpaw ice cream. We do food forest tours. We have open house. It's a hoot. It's a wonderful time. It's the third Saturday in September. It is a ticketed event because it's so popular. And I guess we're going to post it here soon that we're going to do it if life allows, right? Okay. Real quick, the hardy kiwi, cousin to the fuzzy, very ornamental vine, very vigorous vine. Think of wisteria with 100 pounds of fruit on it, because the females can do 100 pounds of fruit. Originally brought into the country as an ornamental because it's such a pretty vine. The fruits are smooth skinned, the size of like a really large grape, and they're delicious. There's a little kiwi, sometimes called kiwi berry. So this little guy in the front's the kiwi berry, and that's its cousin, the fuzzy. I prefer the berries because they're not acidic. They're just pure sweet. I mean, I eat them till my belly hurts. And again, beautiful vine, beautiful flowers. Now you do want to be ready for, you know, their vigor. Don't plant them on a chain link fence and forget about them. You really want to either manage them as a hedge. This is a very well-managed hedge of maybe 2 or 3 kiwis to give you an idea. And by keeping them as a hedge, literally just keep cutting them during the summer, you can encourage them to fruit as well. So, have a plan. That's all I'm saying. I will talk a lot more about these and probably show some videos of them when we do uncommon fruits, because I do love them and they are really worth working with. But a couple tricks. This is a big hardy kiwi arbor. This is about the scale I like to plant for one male and one female, to give you an idea. And that's black locust. All right, running out of time here, but I'm going to talk about hugelkultur real quick. So hugelkultur is a Germanic word basically meaning wood covered with soil. It's taking advantage of all those trimmings from our landscapes that, it's like, well, what do we do? A lot of people are actually exporting, wood from their landscapes. And really, you never want any organic matter to leave your landscape. So you got to be creative. And this is what nature does. When trees fall in the forest, leaves come down over generations, that breaks down, and you come along and you kick that, and it's all black and rich. It makes compost. So we can do that. We've got soil moving around us all the time. We've got trees moving around us all the time. Let's put them together and cover them up and let them start to break down. And you give them a couple of years and you come back in and you've got the perfect compost medium that holds moisture and has available fertility, fungal networks. Again, I will talk more about hugelkultur when we do our food forests. This is in some ways just a teaser for you all to come on back. You can do a small scale. Hugelkultur beds can be small prunings and trimmings. It can be a garden bed that you sit and let break down. Really, it's another variation of compost in place that really, really, really pays off. This is a hugelkultur bed that's probably about 4 years old in this picture, starting to break down. I'm starting to get some comfrey Egyptian walking onion in there. This was a few years ago. And now it's super spongy and moist, and I'm going in there and I'm sticking in jujube trees, pawpaws. It's covered in raspberries. It's just this awesome fertility spot where I can plant pretty dense as well because of all the available fertility and moisture that it holds. So here's something to hurt your brain on. This is actually just combining the concept of the swale, hugelkultur, and food forest. Again, we'll talk about this more when we do our other. And this is my last slide. An edible landscape is not complete without an earthen oven. You got to have somewhere to cook, all that great food. And this is made out of clay, sand, straw. A lot of fun to make these and make them part of your edible landscape. It's a great way to gather people. There's something about food and fire, and you can even grow a pizza garden and enjoy, your pizzas out of your oven. So I think that's it. I think
So,
I'm just
Michael,
about on time.
before we turn to questions, can you remind everyone of what you're going to cover in each of the next successive weeks?
Oh, shucks. How about you do that?
Well, let's see. The next one is mushrooms, right?
Mushrooms.
Right. And then the next one after that is the hugelkultur. And you were going to do the fruit last, right?
Well, I don't have descriptions in front of me, but the mushroom one is going to be more than just mushrooms. It's going to be, how does fungi interact in our landscapes? How do we build healthy soils? And yes, how do we grow them in detail? Then we're going to do food forests and uncommon fruits. So it's going to be really getting into the concepts of building out the food forest. And then I'm really going to get into a lot of my favorite fruits. So I'll talk a lot more in depth about the pawpaw, the hardy kiwi, how to grow them, how to start them. A lot of my favorite companion plants, June berries, that flying dragon hardy citrus. We can talk about figs. I mean, we can get, I'm a plantsman really. So when I get a chance to talk about plants, it's all going to come out. And then the other one is about swales, and I believe that's hugelkultur beds. So rain gardens, swales, hugelkultur beds, how do we really shape our landscapes to passively harvest water and build healthy soils? So that's going to be on soil building and water harvesting. So yeah, those are going to be the three other segments that we unpack.
Great. All right. So guys, I'm going to unmute everybody now. If you happen to be in a noisy place, go ahead and remute yourself and you can jump in with questions.
You coming out for putting autograph?
All right. Anyone with questions? Feel free to go away. I think there was one, Michael, from Brianna, who was wondering about using tires in an edible garden at school. And I kind of said that I thought that might not be the safest thing, but do you have some ideas for?
Yeah, you know, tires do off gas. Now, if I was doing something perennial, something woody and perennial,
Dinner ready?
so let's say I was doing a fig tree in something like that. I talked to a Cornell extension agent once about this. I'm like, what's the concern about planting, you know, a fruit tree on a toxic site? And he said their studies showed that if there's toxins in the soil, they get locked up into the woody matter, the cellulose of the plant, and they were not detecting it in the fruit. So I would investigate more, but I think when you're working with something that's a woody perennial, that you're not going to be pulling it up so much into the fruit, you know, versus if you're doing collards or greens or, you know, something more short term that might absorb more toxins from the soil. So, you know, tires, you know, I would potentially consider using them for perennial fruit.
Okay, Brianna, did that answer your question?
Yeah, thank you so much. It's a great idea, because one of the things is we have to be creative with limited money sometimes, and there's like an abundance of tires. Like we can get those for free. So I was just wondering, like, what would be the most productive way to use them without it being unsafe?
Yeah, maybe you could do like a little food forest idea, you know,
Yeah.
where you've got your fruit tree and then you've got your companions, get a nitrogen fixer in there, and, you know, maybe plant a few other things that you're not necessarily going to eat, but that are creating a little ecosystem for your fruit tree.
Yeah, I love that idea. Thank you so much.
Yeah.
Oh, okay. So if you know your background is noisy, please go ahead and remute yourself. Okay. Does anyone else have any questions for Michael?
I have a question about the kiwis. Somebody is eating my kiwis when they are just starting to fruit. I don't know if it's the squirrels or the birds. And I'd like to know how you protect them, because they're so prolific, I can't possibly net them.
My answer may not help you, but I keep an outdoor cat. And so, yeah, it could be both. You know, might be more likely the squirrel. So, you know, my method's always to keep a half hungry outdoor cat, because you're right. Well, you could hedge your kiwis instead of growing them, you know, on a larger frame. You could put them on a small frame and hedge them, and then if you needed to, you could net them. Yeah.
Okay, anybody else? Come on, guys, don't be shy. We've got 40 people on, so I'm sure somebody has a question.
It's happy hour. Everyone's heading for it.
No, it's Cinco de Mayo, dude.
That's right. That's right. Extra happy hours extended.
All right. Anybody in the chat who has a question?
I've got a question for you, Michael.
Okay.
What's a good source for inoculation for mushrooms?
Yeah, there's a company I really like called Field and Forest Products. I think they're out of Wisconsin. They're wonderful people, and I've gotten spawn from them for more than 10 years, and it's always been excellent quality. So yeah, if you want to get wine cap or any of the shiitakes, they're a wonderful outfit, and their website is very informative as well. So it's very beginner oriented. So you could just read through their website and really learn what you need to do, and then they have everything you need, and it's actually not that expensive to do. So yeah, I'm definitely a big fan of Field and Forest Products.
Great.
Michael, what are you doing anything with lion's mane?
I've tried a little bit. It's not as easy to grow as shiitake and oysters. Those are the two easiest mushrooms I know to grow. I've worked with, I've actually found them in my woods growing, I think, off poplar, tulip poplar. So I think they do well. They're going to take a little more attention, which I haven't really given them. So I think they're on that cusp of being able to be cultivated with more attention. It's like the reishi. Reishi, you know, a little bit of extra attention and moisture attention, you can get them to fruit well for you. So yeah, I haven't messed with them too much. Life hasn't been set up for too much extra attention lately.
Well, I'm trying them on oak. It's my understanding they do best on beach.
Beach, yeah.
I don't have any beach.
Yeah, a friend of mine recently said the same thing. You know, I go and I notch. You know, if I see trees that have just fallen or if one's gotten cut, I'll go notch the trunk and I'll stuff the spawn in the trunk, and then I'll close that. And when you inoculate a trunk, you have all of the moisture access from the roots still, and it's a great way to have that your fungi take hold. And then it has a huge network of woody mass through the root network, and they can fruit for like 10 years. You can get at the stumps, inoculate those, and I think that's where, you know, especially with lion's mane, you'll probably get a lot back.
Yeah.
Hey, Michael?
Yeah.
Lion's
I
mane
got-
is tricky.
Okay, any more questions, folks?
Yeah, I got one question.
I have
Sure.
one.
I'm thinking about pawpaws, and I'm curious as to how you feel about using specific cultivars versus just seedlings.
I'm a big fan. I'm a big fan of both. But I think if you have limited space, I would get cultivars. I'm a big fan of
I go up to the maximum, so that's another.
yeah, Neil Peterson's varieties I like a lot. Shenandoah, Allegheny, Susquehanna. Those are
Okay.
great.
We had it for a while.
PA Golden, Sunflower for some of the older types are really good.
Well, you know, I thought about that a little bit.
Michael, can you hang on for just a second? I'm going to have to mute everyone again.
Okay.
I'm not sure about that.
Sounds like
Okay, go ahead.
happy hour started for some folks.
I know.
So I mean, seedlings are good. They're good rootstock, and select seedlings, meaning that they're, you know, seeds that were collected from an orchard, are also a really good choice. You'll probably, you know, they come very much like their parents. So if you're getting a select seedling, which is a seed grown from an orchard of grafted trees, you're going to probably get decent pawpaws. But to kind of assure that you're going to get, you know, a certain flavor and size and even productivity, going with the cultivars is the way to go. That said, you know, cultivars are dead end for genetics. And if you really want to sort of test and kind of perpetuate genetics of pawpaws, then keep growing seedlings, and finding what does well for your region can be really helpful. Especially if you're on the edge of where pawpaws like to grow, then I would definitely recommend working with seedlings and finding out who's got successful trees in your area and growing them out, and kind of helping the pawpaw adapt is important. So both have their place.
Okay, Michael, Paula has a question in the chat. She's wondering whether fig trees survive the winters here in New Jersey.
The root systems typically do, and then what happens is they get winter burn, mostly from northern wind exposure often. But you can cut your figs back. I think keeping your figs cut back in general to 6 feet is a good practice for assuring you're going to get fruit during the season. And then it can also keep them low, and you can wrap them at the end of the season, stuff them full of leaves, and put like a sort of a poly bag weave over the top so that the leaves don't sink down, and you kind of encapsulate them for the winter, and then that'll help them fight off that winter burn. A lot of times if a fig is established already, living for many years, if the winter burn kills it, it'll resprout. But the challenge is, so if they resprout, that's where I would also keep them down, because if they resprout, they might just want to keep growing themselves and not put energy into maturing that fruit in the short season that we have in the Northeast and Mid-Atlantic in a lot of places. So I like to keep my fig bushes cut back even during the growing season, so that I take the energy and push it into the fruit to mature. So I try to keep my figs at 6 feet almost year round.
So Michael, I think, should we cheat a little since Charlie's on the phone? Charlie, do you have anything to add?
Yeah.
No, not really.
Okay.
He's got it. I've got one that's outdoors and a bunch of them in pots. So it's once they get, you're right.
Yeah.
Once they get very big, they're hard to protect outdoors.
Yeah,
But also try to plant them against a south-facing house, a building, particularly a garage or your house.
Yeah.
That helps.
Or on the south side of a big hugelkultur bed is another spot. I found Chicago hardy to be one of my favorites for being productive, responsive to reshooting and fruiting. That's one of my favorites. And then, yeah, you can grow them in pots and shuttle them in and out for a number of years, but then they typically kind of outgrow the pots and become less productive. So I definitely, and mulch the heck out of them, keep that ground, well insulated and moist.
They outgrow your power, your ability to move them too.
That's right. That's right. A couple years, that's fine. Then stick it in the ground.
Yep. Yeah, that's Chicago hardy. That's what I have outdoors too.
Yeah, I like it.
Christina's asking whether you can recommend a source for pawpaw trees.
Aha, Charlie West, he's the man. He's got the best pawpaws, and I mean that because most pawpaw growers don't grow them in deep pots, and they have a tap root like a nut tree that ideally doesn't get compromised. So you want, ideally 9, 12 plus inch deep tree pots, and Charlie West does that. So Charlie is always my number one recommendation for pawpaws. I have pawpaws, but you have to come to our nursery to get them, or our Pawpaw Fest. Beyond that, in my new pawpaw book, I've got a whole list of nurseries, kind of in order of who I think does the best job. Charlie's number one.
All right, and I guess there's a bunch of questions about figs. Can you recommend a fertilizer for the fig trees?
Gosh, I never fertilize mine. They do really well in poor soil. They come from the Mediterranean where it's hot and dry and poor soil, and that's the most productive figs I've ever seen. I think to a degree you want to be careful you don't over fertilize your figs, because they're gonna go crazy with their growth. They're gonna grow their bush. They're gonna grow their leaves and their stems, and they're gonna go for it as a bush less than go for it for the fruit. So if anything, I would say, make sure there's minerals in the soil, whether that's azomite or some kind of rock powders are always good, because that's going to encourage, root and fruit growth. But I'd be real careful on nitrogen. What do you say, Charlie?
Absolutely. You don't want nitrogen.
Yeah, take it easy on them. Yeah, I mean, sometimes, I hate to say it, but under stress, you might get more fruiting out of them.
I think so.
Yeah, that's why they do well in pots. They get stressed. They get drought and root bound, and they're like, man, we better fruit and reproduce, and boom, they glut the figs. They're just very drought tolerant. So, yeah, don't be too nice to them.
Hey, Michael, I've got a question for you.
Yeah, go ahead.
About comfrey. I see in the books that there is common comfrey and Russian comfrey. Are they really different? And
Yeah, there's a lot of different comfreys. I'm a big comfrey fan.
does well in this area.
Oh yeah, I mean, I know of at least 9 or 10 different comfrey species, and I grow like probably 4 of them. So there's the standalone, tall, comfrey that most people are familiar with, and that's Russian. There's a couple varieties that are, purportedly more sterile, meaning that their seeds aren't that viable, but they've all got a little bit of viability. But the one that I use extensively, and I'm going to really share this a lot in my food forest talk, is a running comfrey. It's called Heedcote, Hidcote, and it gets to be about 20 inches tall in full sun, and it has a light blue flower, and it's a wonderful runner in the sense that it creates a sort of a complete ground cover that keeps your soil moist. It feeds it. It's an awesome pollinator. It's the first thing up and flowering on our landscape, so the bees love it. You can cut it. It will reshoot and reflower for the bees. I'm a big fan of that. I have another one that's smaller. It's only 12 inches tall, and it's a moderate runner, and it has a white flower. So there's a whole world of comfreys out there. I am such a fan of the comfrey plant, medicinally, for the landscape, for the bees. If you chime in on the food forest one, you'll see how extensively I use it.
Great. Well, I think we're almost out of time. So I just want to make 2 announcements. One is there was about a dozen people who dialed in late because they had trouble getting in and that sort of thing. If you are one of those people and want to see the first 15 minutes, go ahead and email me. I'm the email on the invite, so you can just respond back. And I will send you a link to the presentation so that you can review the first 15, 20 minutes of it. Okay? And I think there was also some people who wanted to see some of the charts again. And so if you go back through the presentation, you can review whatever you want to. Okay, so with that, I think we're pretty much done for tonight. Thank you everyone for dialing in. And if you have any questions or follow-ups, you can go ahead and email us and we'll get back to you with the answers. All right.
Yeah, and we'll see you next week.
Okay, see you next week, everyone.
All right.
Thanks so much.
Thank you.
All right.
Bye-bye.
All right, bye.
Bye. Bye.
Thank you. Bye.